Hello and welcome to another episode of Inflection. I am your co-host, Brian Berletic. Joining me as always is Angelo Giuliano. Hello, Angelo. How are you?
Hi, Brian. I'm good. Always nice to be on the show.
Yes, great to have you. Today we're going to be talking about Myanmar because nobody else is. We're going to give an update about the situation there, and we're going to really focus on these foreign advisors that were surrounding Aung San Suu Kyi before the military took over in February. And I'm very convinced that once people see who these people were and what they were doing, they will understand not only why Myanmar's military took over, but why they really had no choice but to take over. But before we do that, we're going to go over a couple of headline items. The first one is this one. This comes to us from Sputnik. Hong Kong electoral reform officially enters into force. And I want to ask Angelo about this, and I want to ask especially about this part here. The Improving Electoral System Ordinance 2021 was published in the Gazette and came into effect today, the government said in a statement, adding that an improved electoral system can ensure that the city is administered by patriots, as well as successful implementation of the one country, two systems principle. And this part right here about patriots, this is what stuck out to me, at least. And when they talk about patriots, they're obviously, I mean, as far as I know, they're talking about these US-backed groups and these individuals in the government that were running back and forth to Washington, keeping people like that out of office. Angelo, can you give us a little more background into this?
So this concept of patriots and pledging allegiance, it exists all around the world. Keep in mind, when you are an elected official in England, you need to pledge allegiance to the Queen. In the US, you need to pledge allegiance to the Constitution. Well, in Hong Kong, there was lots of things that were not implemented. They were supposed to be implemented through the Article 23 of the Basic Law, which is the mini constitution of Hong Kong. So Hong Kong is a one country, two system. And in order to fulfill the conditions of the one country, two system, the government of Hong Kong had to enact the national security law. So this is a responsibility that Beijing gave to Hong Kong when there was a handover. But because of huge pressure from the oppositions, they never managed to enact this national security law. What Beijing did was to take advantage of the riots, because at the end of the day, those riots became an opportunity for Beijing to fulfill actually the decolonization of Hong Kong. By enacting this national security law, they managed to get rid of the foreign interference, all those fake NGOs and so on that were disrupting the politics. They were corrupting the politics because they have deep pockets. They were corrupting. They had their hands everywhere, absolutely everywhere. So patriots, patriots governing Hong Kong is just a vetting system that basically right now they look at, you've been going to Washington, you've been shaking hands and conspire against China. Well, you are not going to be in the electoral system, and that's only normal. So it's something that is just normal. So there was a 3 steps of those reforms. The first one was enact the national security law. The second step was patriots governing Hong Kong, a vetting system, just ensuring that you pledge allegiance to China, remembering that one country, two system, there is the term first, one country. You cannot have two systems if you don't have the one country. That is extremely important. The protesters always focused on the two systems. They say, we don't want any meddling, but they never respected the one country. And the third element, which is very important, is the reform of the electoral system. Because the tycoons, the very rich tycoons, remember those tycoons, they were the collaborators under the colonial system. So under the British, a few Chinese, they were working closely with the British and they got extremely rich. And actually, Beijing, when there was a handover, they had to negotiate with those tycoons just to have to have a flow, you know, without not have any problems, you know. So they gave them quite a bit of power. So what those tycoons did through time, they were financing both sides, and because we are getting towards the end of the one country two system, we are just halfway. They were starting to get nervous because they have their hands on monopolies, and especially on the land. Remembering that one of the big issues in Hong Kong and the initial reasons of the protest was because of land. The price of housing being very high, it's because the tycoons have their hands on the lands. So those electoral reforms will give much less power to those tycoons. And now, finally, Hong Kong will have a democratic system that will be able to do reforms and economic reforms and give less power to those evil tycoons.
And what I thought is really interesting here is that when you read through this, or you see the same headline but coming from the Western media, because Sputnik is Russian-based media, you see them complaining about how, oh, the politicians in Hong Kong have to pledge allegiance to Beijing. Who else would they pledge allegiance to? I mean, it doesn't even make any sense at all. It's what if we had politicians in the United States? Who else other than Washington should their allegiance be held to? Washington and the people of America. And so this is how the Western media tries to normalize something that is completely abnormal. People in another country having allegiances, connections, and receiving support from foreign powers, something in the West that would never be accepted. But this is expected of Hong Kong. And China is supposed to allow just anybody to run for office in Hong Kong. It's surreal, the hypocrisy there. So that is a good rundown. And because we're talking about foreign interference, I think this next story is very appropriate. So let's go to this one. This is National Endowment for Democracy names Damon Wilson as new president. And this is after almost 40 years of Carl Gershman heading the National Endowment for Democracy. The NED is obviously going through a period of change. They've changed their logo here, and now they've got a new president. And where is he from? What's his background? He's the executive vice president of the Atlantic Council. He's been there since 2011. He was at the National Security Council under Bush. He was also at the U.S. Embassy in Iraq during the war. So his background, okay, for people who are not familiar, maybe real quick. The National Endowment for Democracy, they claim that they're a private independent organization and that they're just supporting freedom around the world. That's their motto. But in reality, they were created by the US government in 1983. They're funded every single year by the US government. They are overseen by the US Congress and the US State Department. It says so on their own website. And what they do is what the CIA used to do. And we could read old articles from the Washington Post and the New York Times that admit this, that this is about regime change. They fund regime change. The same thing the CIA used to do, the NED does. And this was about rebranding. Because when the CIA got caught behind regime change, it looked dirty and destructive, and it is. And so the NED was supposed to make it look like something other than being dirty and destructive, but it still is. It was just a marketing campaign, and I think for many years it worked, but now people are becoming more and more aware of this. And then we just saw Carl Gershman get caught talking about the Belarus opposition and how the NED and the US government were directly involved in every aspect of those protests, how they wanted a very specific candidate in office. So that's not promoting democracy, that's just regime change. And how they wanted to transform Belarus's economy and to subordinate it to US special interests, corporate financier interests. So this guy, Damon Wilson, it's very bad news. The Atlantic Council is one of these Fortune 500 funded think tanks. They determine policy in Washington. They send it there with lobbyists to get passed, and they have control over the corporate media to sell that policy to the American public. And they're pro-war. And Damon Wilson himself is an open advocate of expanding the EU and NATO into Russia, not up to Russia's borders, but he wants to integrate Russia into NATO and the EU. So that's who's going to be heading the NED from now on. So he went from the Atlantic Council promoting these ideas of US hegemony over the planet to now working at the NED, funding the execution of that policy. Angelo, what are your thoughts about Damon Wilson and this makeover that the NED is getting?
It's getting worse and worse. And you see this makeover. I don't see. I mean, it looks like the LGTB flag. I mean, now it's funny. You know, like you have some memes that are showing like bombs being dropped, but on top of the bombs you have this flag. You know, I mean, now CIA agents are going to be, you know, LGTB, you know, you know, this whole new identity politic profile. But at the end, they are still the same violent, even more violent, I would say. You know, we need to be very careful. I think it's getting more sophisticated, and they're trying to tap into different crowds. You know, why do you rebrand this? You know, everything. When the way I look at this is that they're using politics the same as they're using marketing. You know, we are product. How can you push for product and make it attractive for people? You know, this is how it works. You know, it's nothing else than marketing. So they want us to eat a hamburger. We don't want it, but at the end we might end up eating a hamburger without knowing it.
Yeah, and I mean, let's be honest. The NED was specifically created to put a velvet glove over the iron fist of CIA-sponsored regime change. And over the years, I believe that velvet glove has become worn. And with the appointment of Damon Wilson here as the president, I think they're just kind of taking the whole glove off, and they're waving this bloody iron fist of regime change around. They think that it's a sign of strength, but I think it really is a sign of weakness, that the US cannot continue promoting its agenda worldwide under all of these false pretenses. It's becoming more and more open. You can almost sense the desperation. About the logo, they actually did say they redesigned it. Let's put it back up on the screen here again. They said that this was to represent diversity. To me, it kind of looks like a mashup of AT&T, FedEx, and a whole bunch of other corporations, which is very appropriate because everything Damon Wilson did at the Atlantic Council was all underwritten by these giant corporations. And now he's at the NED. And of course, everything he does at the NED is to benefit those corporate interests, has nothing to do with empowering anybody anywhere. It's about US hegemony, and he's an unapologetic proponent of US hegemony all around the globe, and he's going to continue doing that at the NED. And one of these examples of NED-sponsored regime change is unfolding right now in Myanmar with horrible consequences. It was never a peaceful protest in the beginning. I told people back in March, not even a month after the military took over, that those protests against the military were violent. The Western media was covering up the violence. They would try to for as long as possible. And then when that was no longer possible, they would admit, yeah, they're running around with war weapons. This is an open arms conflict now. The opposition is trying to seize power through the use of violence. And I want to go over some of these headlines. This is all, you just check the date. This is from Myanmar Now. Myanmar Now is funded by the US National Endowment for Democracy. Real quick here, National Endowment. So they say right here, Myanmar Now receives funding from the National Endowment for Democracy. This is from Columbia Journalism Review. So let's look at some of these headlines. Police sub-inspector dies after guerrilla attack. And they're talking about these attacks, these ambushes against the police and the military, and they're killing people. So this isn't a defensive campaign. This is an offensive campaign. They are fighting against the military and police, and they're trying to take over. And that was the whole nature of the protest from the very beginning. It wasn't a protest. It was them trying to seize back power, invading police stations and government buildings, and killing anyone in their path. USDP, this is the ruling central government working with the military, member and former local administrator shot and killed in Monin. And they're saying that he's the latest former administrator to be murdered. So this is a targeted campaign of killing. These are death squads going out and killing anyone who is supporting the central government and the military. This is straight up terrorism. The textbook definition of terrorism is using violence to achieve a political goal. And that is exactly what they're doing. Angela, I'm going to show a couple of more headlines. What are your thoughts about this as I show these headlines?
It's very scary. This is mafia style. They're actually putting bombs in schools. They want a boycott of schools. Right now, there's a 75% of school attendance. There's 25% of kids which are either their parents are supporting the protest, or they're just scared to go to school because now they're burning and bombing schools. So this is nothing else than terrorism. But again, it's just the Western media are just putting some nice words, but executing people like this. You are a village leader and you're working with the central government, and you're getting killed just because you're doing your job. So where it is going? I mean, this is already civil war. It's just a military. At this stage, it's not about being pro or against military or pro. We need to look at the country which was already at civil war. It's been at civil war for 50 years. It's not a very united country. Now the last string is Tatmadaw, is the military. If the military falls, we are talking about a huge civil war, chaos, refugees, and a balkanization of Myanmar. And now what you're seeing is that they don't understand that if they keep on pushing those bombs and this fight against the military, Myanmar will be gone. It will be history, and the whole region is going to be in chaos for the next 10, 20 years. It's just crazy.
Exactly. And I think it would even be fair to say that it looked like civil war, but in reality, this was the divide and conquer left over by the British Empire. And when Myanmar technically gained its independence, the British and then also the Americans poured millions and millions of dollars and weapons into the country to ensure that no unity was ever established over the country. The government would never be able to consolidate power, and that it would be divided. And they were trying to open up an opportunity for the West to reassert itself over the country. And this was the whole point of funding and backing Aung San Suu Kyi and her opposition party and this so-called civil society network that the US has built up inside of Myanmar, a parallel society, basically, to try to overwrite Myanmar's indigenous institutions. And this is what's going on there. And now we see, and I warned people back in March, I said, this is going to be exactly like Libya and Syria. It's the same architects. And they're using all the same tools that they did to create the crisis in Libya and Syria back in 2011 and then onward. And you're exactly right. It's going to balkanize the country if the military is unable to regain control and stop these groups. It's going to end up exactly like Libya, the whole country killing each other indefinitely until another central power is able to seize control and unite everyone together. So it's very tragic, and people probably might doubt that, the US was behind all of this and that they were funding all of this. But actually, the topic we're going to be focusing on here is, here, let's go to this article right here. This is from Frontier Myanmar, it's an opposition newspaper, and they're going to talk about Aung San Suu Kyi's foreign advisors. And this was the 2016's most influential people. And they talk about Aung San Suu Kyi, obviously, and all of these other figures. And then if we come down here, the foreign advisors, shadow men. You won't see them in the newspapers or responding to MP questions, but rest assured they are there working away in the shadows. And And they talk about this so matter of fact, as if there's nothing wrong with this at all. And they're talking about foreign advisors with close relations to Aung San Suu Kyi have established themselves as important players in the reform agenda of the government. Now, Angelo, I can't imagine someone admitting to all of this happening inside the United States, like Trump has all these foreign advisors, like Russians in the Oval Office, or Boris Johnson in the UK with a team of Chinese advisors walking around with him. Angela, have you ever seen treason described in such casual terms?
That is crazy, really, especially when you look at the background. When you look at the position, you know, most of them are anti-Chinese, anti-Belt and Road Initiative. They're actually focusing, their main focus is just how they can destroy all those projects. We're talking about, they managed to stop around $10 billion worth of infrastructure project. And Myanmar desperately needs those projects. This will help the economy, but also will help the cohesions of the whole country. Remember, once you start building roads around the country, all through the jungle where you have all those ethnic minorities which are still fighting, randomly fighting with the central government, maybe you might unite the country. And again, you know, those projects are all viable. We're talking about a dam will bring electricity. You know, when you start going to such project, you do the calculation, how much I'm going to invest and how much I will have in terms of, you know, revenues. And we all know that the Belt and Road Initiative, most of the loan coming from China are way better than IMF and the World Bank. And they are not conditions to some economic reforms, keeping in mind that the IMF, you know, when they're coming into a country, they want you to open your country to all the predators, capital predators. And this is one of the reasons that Myanmar has been attacked, because it didn't want to do that mistake. It didn't want to do what Russia did, the USSR, and Yeltsin did. Yeltsin sold so many resources. Myanmar, and especially the military, don't want to do that. I just want to go back to, remember that 2010 task force, which was led by George Soros in Myanmar, where you had all those, you know, Wesley Clark, you had those advisors. Back then, they were advising the Soros Foundation, and then they became advisor of Aung San Suu Kyi, where the main focus was not about how we can improve Myanmar or so on. It was how we can get our hands into the resources of Myanmar. Keep in mind, what does Myanmar have? You know, they have some resources. They have jade, oil, gas, and most important, they are working. They are it's a critical country for the Belt and Road Initiative. Is getting an access to the sea, to China. There's a pipeline that is going and that is sending a lot of oil and gas to China. That is the problem. So it's just sickening to see what is happening. And
this is a good point that you're actually talking about the first foreign advisor that we were going to bring up, Sean Turnell. So if we go here and we're looking at these foreign advisors that they're so casually talking about, they're saying the most well-known of these is probably Sean Turnell. That's who you were talking about, Angelo, an economist. He's from Australia. He's an Australian citizen, and he's been working with Aung San Suu Kyi on economic reform. Well, they say economic reforms, but as you were pointing out, they were just talking about opening the country up and just selling it out to the West so they could strip mine it like they've done to so many other countries. And it's funny that you were talking about the IMF and their predatory capitalists. That's the same narrative that they use to demonize China. They also talk about Robert Sanpei and Joseph Fisher. So those are the three we're going to be focusing on today. You were just talking about Sean Turnell. Let me see if I can find that document that you were just talking about right here. Here's the actual task force you were talking about. This is put out by something called the Asia Society, but this is actually funded by Western corporate financier interests. The co-chairs, Wesley Clark, and here's someone heading USAID. and you have all these other people, the U.S. Embassy in Myanmar, which they're still calling Burma. You had Sean Turnell is on here, Kenneth Roth from Human Rights Watch.
What a coincidence.
Yeah, what a coincidence. And even George Soros himself is on here somewhere. Where is his name? Pretty sure George Soros. Let's see.
Yeah, he's in there, that's for sure.
Yeah, so they're talking about him right here as members. And let's see, Sean Turnell's name is right here as one of the principal advisors. And so we just saw the Frontier Myanmar article here admitting to Sean Turnell and his role as Aung San Suu Kyi's advisor. There's many other profiles that admit to this. Here he's Dr. Sean Turnell. He's the associate professor here, and he's also economic advisor, National League for Democracy. So again, we have this Australian as an economic advisor for Aung San Suu Kyi, as if there's nobody in Myanmar capable of doing this. They had to bring in this white man from Australia to do it. And he just so happens to have connections to Open Society, USAID. In some of these interviews, they even talk about how he's in Washington, D.C. talking to Congress. So he is an agent of foreign influence and interference in Myanmar, and he's one of the right-hand men of Aung San Suu Kyi in terms of economic policy, of opening the country up, and just as you said, blocking all of this progress that's actually being made by China, building actual infrastructure that Myanmar needs. And you also, again, you put it perfectly. These infrastructure projects are going to unite the country: rail, pipelines, highways, bridges, dams, everything. And they know that that's going to undermine their campaign of divide and conquer by arming and funding these ethnic groups. And so they want to head that off. They want to block these projects at any cost. So that is Sean Turnell.
I just want to add something, Brian. Remember Sean Turnell, he was arrested exactly at the same time as Aung San Suu Kyi. And he had some confidential secret documents related to Myanmar. So it's not a coincidence. We had this coup. A lot of people, a lot of Western media never talk about what really happened during this coup. And actually, it's not exactly a coup. It's a constitutional takeover. In the constitution, it's written that the military can take over for a period of 1 year, and then they have to reestablish democracy right after. So he was arrested along with Aung San Suu Kyi, but also people from the Open Society of George Soros were arrested, and some funds were blocked. And also, it's in the context of very large electoral frauds. We never talk about those frauds. One of the main reasons there was this coup, it was because of frauds. The global light on Myanmar is showing every day some statistics about the frauds. And the frauds were in the form of people being in the votes like 2 or 3 times, their names in 2-3 times. So you can imagine it's like stuffing. We call this stuffing the ballots. So, and again, I can see a relationship, with USAID. USAID has been pouring a huge amount of money into these electoral reforms, like how to organizing votes and so on. So you are giving the task of organizing the elections to USAID, and there might be some huge corruption there, and disruption of the democratic process. So
and I just want to point out something that you were the one that showed me. This is the Myanmar Development Institute. There's Sean Turnell's name right there. And this was the tweet that you sent to me. Last week, Myanmar Development Institute and USAID PSDA signed a grant agreement on organizational capacity building support for the Myanmar Development Institute. So this is Sean Turnell sitting on the board of this Myanmar Development Institute. And not only was he part of the task force involving someone heading the USA, but his organization is getting money. And again, why is a man from Australia on a Myanmar Development Institute board of directors? And why are they taking this USAID money? It's so obvious what they're doing here. It's so obvious. Angelo, you're the one who pointed this out. Do you have anything else to add about this?
Well, it's just, I think the whole system is getting more and more sophisticated. It's all about, you know, probably the government has some measures to protect the national sovereignty. I'm sure Myanmar already, you know, blocks lots of those NGOs and those interference, but they get more and more sophisticated. So here you see, for example, Turnell probably wouldn't be able to be hired by the government, but then he's put as an advisor, and then you have intermediary company which is financing him, MDI, which is financed by USAID. It's just that the whole system is getting more and more sophisticated. And I think in the future it's going to get worse. We use NED because for our studies, because NED is one of the most transparent organizations. You can see to who they finance and the amount. The problem is that this is only the tip of the iceberg. There are some institutions that are far bigger, that have, you know, but that are completely opaque. I'm talking about the USAGM, which is the propaganda arm. You know, they finance Falun Gong in China. They finance Radio Free Asia, Radio Free Europe, and you know, we're talking about billions there. And then you have USAID, which is the face is humanitarian. They say, oh, we are going to help the population and so on. But yes, maybe 50%. But then you have 50% of the funds which are going to what they call the civil society. But in reality, it's how we are going to corrupt the whole democratic process. So now what we're living in Myanmar is nothing else than the hijacking of the democracy. And it's just, I don't know if it's out of being naive for the government or the Tatmadaw, or if they let it go rot. And once those interference get exposed, then you can attack them. And that's that's the second thing. I would think that it's probably the second options. What they did was that they wanted to put Aung San Suu Kyi and all this foreign interference to be exposed. And then once you're not attacked for a few years, then you expose them and you say, oh, see, we had such and such evidence, and then we can take over and do some real reforms. Because again, you know, Myanmar is still colonized. It has never gained its freedom. And you know, it's a utopia, again, just to talk about democracy. How can you install a democracy in a country which is so divided ethnically, which you have so much foreign interference? It's impossible. You don't have,
awesome.
We talk about this. You don't have sovereignty. You cannot have a democracy. You can't.
Exactly. And having an Australian running Myanmar's economic policy, whispering into Aung San Suu Kyi's ear about letting in the IMF and the World Bank. And there is a talk where he just openly admits that. And we're going to put all of the links in the video description below of all of this. And people can see for themselves how he had his hands all over the levers of Myanmar's economic policy. And this would be unthinkable for any nation anywhere else in the world to have this sort of invasive interference, having literally foreigners as advisors at the highest levels of government like this. Let's take a look at, oh, well, you also said about blocking the One Belt, One Road initiative. And here is a headline from Bloomberg: China's 7.5 billion Myanmar port crazy, Suu Kyi advisor says. Who is that advisor? It was Sean Turnell. You see that? You see how that works? He's this Western guy. He's from Australia. He's from a country whose government is cutting the wrists of Australia economically to spite China, to please Washington, but bleeding Australia dry economically. And now he's trying to do the same thing to Myanmar. Myanmar's biggest trade partner is China, and then Thailand, and then Singapore, and the West doesn't even register. They just have like a few select projects and partnerships. So this is what Sean Turnell was in Myanmar doing. Absolutely outrageous.
Those advisors, they have one common point, is they all fight really hard. Most of their time, they fight against the Belt and Road Initiative. That's the main focus. When you look at the post of Turnell on his Facebook page, it's all against China, against the Belt and Road Initiative. And if they cannot go, they find any type of ways just to stop those projects. The dam project, there was a huge dam project. Well, they pay protesters, and they hire those green NGOs. So basically, they're like, you know what? We want to protect your fauna, your fishes, and so on. It's okay. You are going to starve, but because we are green, we want you to protect your fauna and the environment and so on. It's just ridiculous. And you have those people, they're coming all the way from Germany, from Sweden, and trying to lecture the locals. They're getting a Western salary. They're living the good life in Myanmar, but they still want the people to starve. Because it's going to bring so much to those people. And again, you see, $1 in Myanmar is worth a lot. It doesn't take much to corrupt those villages to fight against the Belt and Road Initiative. You just need one village. You send them, a few $1,000s, and that's it. You stop a $1 billion project, dam project.
Yes, exactly. And if you look into the details of these projects, the dams don't just generate electricity and bring in infrastructure, just to reach the dam, but they also contribute to flood control and irrigation. And there's all kinds of ways to build them to also protect local ecosystems. So, and it's done by the West, who has plenty of dams of their own. And we've seen projects here in Asia where they're also doing that. Let's move on from Sean Turnell, the Australian economic advisor, and let's take a look at this one, this Joseph Fisher. And this is from Myanmar Times, again, another opposition newspaper. This has no love for the current military or central government. British spy claim in smear campaign against NLD leader. And they're saying claims on social media that a British spy is working as a political advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi have been dismissed by the National League for Democracy as a ridiculous smear campaign ahead of the elections. And they're talking about Joseph Fisher right here. They're accusing him of being a spy for British intelligence services, but who is he? So let me find it here. British Ambassador Andrew Patrick told the Myanmar Times that Mr. Fisher was taking unpaid leave on a break from the Foreign Office. So he's working for the British government while serving as an advisor for Aung San Suu Kyi. And I have to remind people that Myanmar used to be a British colony. So the country that had colonized Myanmar and exploited its people and its resources for well over 100 years, and is still trying to reassert itself over Myanmar and its future. They have an employee from their government serving as Aung San Suu Kyi's advisor. Angelo, as I searched through here for another key quote, what do you think about Joe Fisher, who, by the way, was working at the British Embassy in Myanmar before working for the Foreign Office and becoming Aung San Suu Kyi's advisor? What do you think about that?
Well, there's lots of meddling through the consulates and the embassies. You know how you can see the extent of the meddling is just you look at the size of the embassy or consulate. You go to Thailand, the US embassy is huge. You go to Hong Kong, the consulate, we're talking about 1,000 people working in the consulate. In Afghanistan, it's probably one of the biggest one. In Iraq, I think probably one of the biggest embassy in the world is probably the US embassy in Iraq. So that gives you the extent of the meddling. So now it's it's how they get those protesters get resource is through those so-called diplomats, through those foreign agencies. The most active in Myanmar are probably the US and UK. But keep in mind, it's not you getting more and more meddling from other countries. You saw this in Thailand, right? You saw in Thailand German ambassador just in the protest. There are lots of things you can relate between Myanmar and Thailand. So lots of those those people working in the embassy or consulate, they're just working there for regime change as well, you know.
Yes,
Which would be unacceptable. I mean, imagine if a Chinese ambassador would join a BLM protest in the US. It would be like big news. It would be you know, they would recall the ambassador.
Yes, and here let's look at this article. Mr. Fisher, who was second secretary and embassy spokesperson in Yangon from 2011 to 2014, did not respond to repeated requests for comment. And on his LinkedIn account, he describes himself as International Development Liaison Officer at Office of Aung San Suu Kyi. He also coordinates interviews with the foreign media for the NLD leader. Again, why does Aung San Suu Kyi need not just a British citizen, but a man who is working for the British Foreign Office while concurrently serving as her advisor, and who had formerly worked at the embassy in her country? Again, a former British colony. Why would she need someone like that to do this job instead of just someone from Myanmar, which I think is universally understood as being appropriate, and having these foreign advisors as being entirely inappropriate. And by the way, there is not that much more information about Joseph Fisher, not like what we had with Sean Turnell or the next advisor we're going to talk about, Robert Sanpei. There's hardly anything at all on what Joseph Fisher was doing. So maybe he was a spy or just a handler assigned to basically hold Aung San Suu Kyi's leash as the West was trying to reassert itself once she got into power. And so,
yeah, that is the question. Are they advisor, or is she taking orders from them? I mean, really, I have the impression the more we study Aung San Suu Kyi, we you know, she was put in her position from the West. And I wonder if she's just now a U.S. puppet or just a hostage. She's just taking orders. She's been going towards this path, and against, you know, she hasn't given completely the allegiance to Myanmar. You know, when you're taking advisors or you're taking orders from those foreign advisors, you're not working for your country. You're working for other interests, you know, and there are some cases of corruption too. You know, I don't know if you saw there's a video of someone saying, well, he's been giving half $500,000 US directly to Aung San Suu Kyi in gold. You know, it's extremely corrupted system. So that's the question: are they advisors or are they giving orders to Aung San Suu Kyi? Because again, you know, Sean Turnell, he was working for the U.S. State Department. He's been working for U.S. State Department, George Soros, and in 2010, and now he's one of the closest advisors to Aung San Suu Kyi. Is he giving orders?
It really looked like they were, and that well, if you just look at Aung San Suu Kyi's entire background, every aspect of her and her political party and the supporting so-called civil society that helped her get into power was created by the U.S. and British government. There's no actual genuine support in the country for that. Even people who think they genuinely support Aung San Suu Kyi have to ask themselves, is it because they really do, or because the U.S. poured millions and millions of dollars to convince them that they did? And this is the whole problem with foreign interference, and why it's so utterly unacceptable, and why it's recognized as completely undermining self-determination and therefore democracy. There's one more. There's this Robert Sanpei. So we're going to go back to the Frontier Myanmar article. Another is Robert Sanpei. And look at how they word this. A Hong Kong-based lawyer who has worked with Aung San Suu Kyi for several years. That's a weird way of putting it, isn't it? Hong Kong-based, it kind of makes you think he's from Hong Kong. Maybe he's Chinese. Maybe he's a Chinese citizen. They don't really tell you. But then there's this other Frontier Myanmar article also put out in 2016, and it's actually by Robert Sanpei, The Way Forward on Resolving Commercial Disputes. And he's talking about overhauling Myanmar's legal system. And if we go down to the bottom, they actually have a little mini bio. Robert Sanpei is a British and Hong Kong qualified lawyer of Myanmar descent who works at international firm Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher. He has advised Aung San Suu Kyi on legal affairs. And they make it sound like he's like her personal lawyer or something, but that's not what they meant when they talk about legal affairs. They mean the entire legal system of Myanmar, including rewriting the entire constitution, because here he is. This is a video of him being interviewed specifically about his role as advisor for Aung San Suu Kyi, and he just openly says they're going to rewrite the constitution to make it easier for Aung San Suu Kyi, her political party and support network, to consolidate power over the country. Angelo, what do you think about that? There's one more thing I want to show people. I got to dig for it a little bit. Angelo, how about you respond to that?
Well, look at the specialization of Sampé. His specialization is arbitration on the Belt and Road Initiative. That is his specialization. He's actually working for an institution, a chamber, which is dealing, has a focus on the Belt and Road Initiative. So his main focus is the Belt and Road Initiative, and he's working, is helping her to find solution on how to rewrite a constitution, keeping in mind that the constitution that was beaten in Myanmar gave 25% of seats to the Tatmadaw, the militaries, and you need, in order to rewrite the constitution, you need over 75%. So this is how the Tatmadaw is still controlling, because otherwise, if they were to rewrite the constitution, then it would be Western written. It would be written by the US, basically. So that is the last thing. That is how they are still keeping the sovereignty of Myanmar. They didn't give it up all. Keep in mind that all those reforms were done because under the pressure. Myanmar there are still a lot of sanctions against Myanmar, and it's just surviving under those sanctions, and it's another country which is being blackmailed. It's either you open up you market to the predators, the Western predators, and to a Western style democracy, or will make you starve. So that's one of the aim, of those people. They're working for writing a new constitution, and also to fight the Belt and Road Initiative. They want Myanmar to shift away from China, which doesn't make any sense. Myanmar has been trading with China for thousands of years. 30% of trade is done with China. You can't change that. This is natural, and when you look at the trade, Myanmar US is just marginal. It's 1-2%, and remember, the US and the West always promised a lot of investment. If Myanmar wants to open up and to democratize, it never came in. It was just empty promises.
Exactly, Angelo. And something that you said about, Robert Sampé also, if you listen to that talk in that video, this one right here, I'll show it again so people can find it on Vimeo. Robert Sampé on Myanmar's future. He talks about part of the legal overhaul and of the constitution isn't just to help Aung San Suu Kyi consolidate power, but it's also to create the legal landscape that will enable Western corporate financier interests to come in and do what they always do to targeted economies, just rampage and pillage. And this is what I wanted to show people, this right here. So we can't get to the bottom of where Robert Sampé is from. These opposition newspapers refuse to talk about this, and his features do kind of somewhat resemble someone from Myanmar. So that's what they're hoping, is that people just assume that he's maybe Chinese or maybe from Myanmar. Nobody knows. But if you come down to his own profile, to nationality, he's British right there. He's a British citizen. So that's Joe Fisher working for the British government. And here's Robert Sampé, a British citizen. So that's two British citizens and an Australian surrounding Aung San Suu Kyi and advising her on the most sensitive issues involving Myanmar and its sovereignty. The very heart of a nation's sovereignty is its constitution. And we have a British national. By the way, his language is English and intermediate French. I don't see any indigenous language spoken in Myanmar listed there. So He's a British citizen. He's trying to rewrite the constitution. Sean Turnell, an Australian citizen, working with the US government, trying to rearrange and reorder Myanmar's economy to subordinate it to US interests. And Joseph Fisher, who we really don't know what he was doing because there's hardly any information. So he's an advisor to Aung San Suu Kyi, and we're not even really sure what he was doing aside from managing her media campaign or her media contacts with the West. So again, I think this is a good place to end this.
Let's look at this, just one thing. Look at this arbitration chamber. So Sam Pei is working for an arbitration chamber that has an exclusive focus on the Belt and Road Initiative. So why would you have an advisor on arbitration on the Belt and Road Initiative, a close advisor? Aung San Suu Kyi, a lot of people, they saw Aung San Suu Kyi signing Belt and Road Initiative. Well, just because she had no choice. But right after signing those deals, they did everything to stop them. And the problem now is that most of those deals, they are under arbitration. You sign a deal and now you trying to stop them or delay them. And this is probably one of the reasons you have a collusion. You have this fight between the Tatmadaw and the movement of Aung San Suu Kyi. And she's working again. She's working against Myanmar's interest. When you really look at what people from Myanmar needs, they desperately need those infrastructure projects. And you have a leader, in the hands of the US, which is saying, which is finding excuses not to go ahead with those infrastructure projects.
Yeah, so in the beginning, we kind of used the example of, say, Donald Trump surrounded in the Oval Office by Kremlin agents serving as his advisors, or Boris Johnson in the UK surrounded by Chinese advisors, determining everything from rewriting the Constitution to reordering the economy to subordinate it to these foreign interests. And how would we describe the US or the UK under those circumstances? I think we would describe it, and this ties back to Damon Wilson, because he likes to talk about Eastern European countries as captive or hostage nations to Russia, because Russia has some influence over them because of obvious historical, linguistic, and ethnic, and all kinds of considerations. But he's acting as if they're captive or hostage nations. If you are surrounded by foreign advisors who are trying to reorder your country to serve the interests of their country, you are in reality a captive or a hostage nation. Myanmar under Aung San Suu Kyi with these foreign advisors was a captive nation, a hostage nation of its former colonial masters in the UK and also of the United States, the heir of British imperialism. And so now we can see why Myanmar's military not only thought they had to do this, but why they had no choice but to do this. You, as the military of a nation, your task is to defend the nation against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Aung San Suu Kyi, surrounded by foreign advisors, clearly serving foreign agendas ahead of Myanmar's own best interests, was a domestic threat that had to be dealt with. I really cannot even see any other course of action the military could have taken except just allow the country to be hijacked out from under the people of Myanmar. And you don't have to like the Myanmar military's politics. This is about sovereignty. This is something that is just fundamentally wrong. It's 2021 and we still have this naked imperialism where there's white men walking around Myanmar determining the country's future for it. British viceroys of the modern day. Angelo.
I just want to remind our viewers, opposition, it's just what you said just before. It's not for answer. We're not taking sides here. We want to expose the foreign meddling and how the West wants to create chaos in Myanmar. It's not about being pro Aung San Suu Kyi, pro-democracy, pro-Tatmadaw. No. I think right now it's just exposing and trying to educate people. We're doing lots of research, and those research, you'll never find this in mainstream media. Here, it's not about the good and bad. It's just at this stage, just exposing what is going on in Myanmar. And clearly, Myanmar doesn't have the preconditions to have a democracy. There's a civil war going on. There's violence. They don't respect each other's differences. There's foreign meddling. There's money interference in politics. Also, it's just maybe a lack of maturity. You know, it's a process. And again, you see in the West, in what we so-called mature democracy, it's still you know, they are still not real democracies. You know, and we could talk about democracy, the concept of democracy more. You know, there's two concepts. There's a voting and electing. So when is representative democracy, is it a real democracy? Not necessarily. You have a democratic right when you have the right to vote. When you elect someone, you're electing a master that is going to decide for you for the next 4 or 5 years. And what happens in the West is very often you give up your right to vote for 4 or 5 years. He's gonna deceive you, you know, and it's always a cycle of elected regrets. So it's a utopia. It's not working everywhere. One of the few countries that work well, you know, is Scandinavian countries, Switzerland, you know. But again, you know, it's about redefining what is a real democracy. You know, what is it intended to? And sometimes it doesn't work because there's a mob rule. Imagine in society when you have 50% of the people that is ruling over minorities of 49%. You know, and again, if you were to ask me which country would not be fit for democracy, I would tell you right away, Myanmar is one of the worst examples, especially at this stage. It's not ready, and they need to regain their independence, get rid of foreign interference. That is what we're fighting. You know, we're not taking sides here. We want to educate people, just highlight, be careful. You know, those Western countries, look at what they did to Libya, Iraq, and so in Yemen. Do you think they cared about them? They don't. Western media, they don't care about this. It's about, you know, they want Myanmar either to take your side. If you don't take your side, then we are going to destroy them. Let's bring chaos to Myanmar. Let's destroy. And we don't want lives destroyed. You know, we've seen what happened in so many countries, you know, and it's very sad. It's very sad that another country is getting into this democratic trap.
Exactly, and I think that it's important to repeat that. We're pointing out the foreign interference. So whether you like Myanmar's military and the current central government's policies or not, that is the business of the people of Myanmar to decide, and their business alone. And right now they're unable to do that because of this immense industrial scale interference that the US and the British are involved in through the National Endowment for Democracy, the US aid, corporate foundations like Open Society, and everything else. And the UK has their equivalent for all of these, and they're all actively involved in Myanmar. Until that stops, there is no real democracy. There cannot be any real self-determination in Myanmar. And what we're watching is a cycle of injustice driven by self-serving interests by the US and the UK, who were openly imperialists in the past, and they're still doing it even today. Like I said, you have white men walking around in Myanmar trying to determine the country's future for it. It's unacceptable. It always has been. And now it's 2021. It is utterly unacceptable. And just like you said, Angelo, we're not going to hear about this in the mainstream media. That's why we keep talking about it, you and I hope more people in the alternative media start picking up on this. All of the sources that we just covered are going to be in the video description below. I have a whole 3-part series now on all 3 of these advisors, going into their backgrounds in detail. That will all be linked to in the video description below. Angela, I want to thank you again for joining me on this episode of Inflection. We'll be back next week. We don't know what we're going to talk about, but thanks for joining us, and thank you for all of the support.
Thank you, Brian.